Welcome to Hey Chaplain. My name is Jared Altick, and I'm a chaplain with the police department. This podcast exists because I wanted police officers to hear the wisdom and encouragement from the older, experienced officers I was learning from. But that information doesn't always filter down to them, so I created this podcast in order for them to get life-saving and career-changing support. On this podcast, you'll hear from detectives and dispatchers, U.S. Marshals and county sheriffs, and the occasional British detective. From the LAPD to Scotland Yard, the guests on Hey Chaplain are sharing their wisdom and experience so that you don't have to do everything the hard way. There are two conflicting truisms in law enforcement. One is old and one is new. First, it's stereotypical that cops, when you ask them, don't want their kids to go into the same line of work. Second, it's becoming more and more true that law enforcement families are some of the only reliable places to find applicants for the job. Police work, like firefighting and the military, is becoming a family business, and we're seeing more multi-generational law enforcement families. This interview is one of my new favorites. You see, Deputy Chief Kevin Steele was retiring from the department that I serve at about the time I started volunteering there. But one of my first ride-alongs was with a young patrol officer named Steele, Kevin's son, Michael. When I learned that Michael was the third consecutive generation of that family to serve our city, I knew there would be an interesting story there. So today, we're talking to Kevin Steele, the middle generation of that line. Here's Kevin Steele. Hello, Kevin. How are you today?
Doing well, Jared. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm glad you're here today. I'm interested to hear about your story because you have a multi-generational family in law enforcement, specifically in the department that I serve. So can you tell me a little bit about your family history?
My father was on the department. He retired as a captain. He came on in 1961. Charlie Steele, Captain Steele. And
what a great name.
Yeah. He served about 27 years, retired out as a captain, administrative assistant to the Bureau Director of Services of the department, KCK, PD. Then myself came on as a cadet, 1982.
So like right out of high school?
Yeah, right out of high school. 2 weeks out of high school, I was in formation as a cadet and getting yelled at by the sergeant.
You grew up son of a captain, so
yeah.
Did you know these sergeants already?
I didn't. Some of them I kind of knew, but I did not know a lot of them. Growing up around it, being raised like in the PD when I was a kid, I'm kind of digressing, but I remember my dad sometimes had to go into work, and we would be dropped off at the dispatch sack, and the ladies at dispatch would be watching us, my sister and I, back at the old City Hall days.
Yeah.
And
so how much did you overlap your dad once you started your career?
It was, well, I would say from cadet time, it was about 5 years.
Okay. So you had some time as a cadet and some time as a sworn officer where you overlapped. Your dad was, the XO of operations or something like that, right?
Yeah, it would be the XO nowadays, yeah.
Okay.
He was an XO over the Services Bureau, and he actually also was over operations, too, when earlier in the 80s before I came on.
So your dad's helping run things, and you're a brand new officer, and then you go through your career. Now, I know you were a PIO for a long time.
Yes.
Tell me just a little bit about that.
It was a great experience, actually. Came into planning and research in end of 92, and a part of that planning and research gig was that you had to do PIO duties. And so it was you were juggling a lot of different hats, obvious, in there.
How much training were you given to talk to the media?
None. None whatsoever. In fact, I remember the first day in there, I was called into the captain's office, the aide to the chief, and there was another lieutenant in there that I knew since I was a kid. Both of them I actually knew since I was a kid. And they said, hey, Kevin, welcome aboard, and, welcome to planning. And guess what? Part of that job is you're also going to be a PIO with another officer in there. And I said, oh, really? And so they gave me the old radio pagers. They were actually they were a pager that went through the communication system, actually through the radio system.
Okay.
They said, you're on call effective today. And I was like, wow, okay. And I said, well, what do I do? And they said, well, you'll figure it out. If you have a problem, try to get a hold of us or something. In those days, they didn't have cell phones or nothing. So I was like, okay, figure it out.
Yeah.
I appreciate they had a lot of confidence in me. It was one of those things. I go, okay.
I wonder if it's misplaced confidence, but yeah.
I was like, okay, we'll get it done. And so, being a good soldier, as they say, it's just the way I was raised around there. I said, okay, I'll do it. It was Christmas in 92. And one of the first call-outs, it was like less than 24 hours later, I had a major call-out, and it was a hostage barricade robbery that went wrong, in which there was a shooting inside and that type of thing, and barricade, and they had a car chase and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, wow.
And the police were shooting at the bad guy and that type of thing, and back and forth. And so, yeah.
And then you get thrown out there.
And I got thrown out
cameras.
there. Yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It was Christmas time, and yeah.
They have a uniform requirement if you're going to appear on television back then? Like, did you have to be in your Class A's, or did you have to?
You had to be
like that?
Yeah, you had to be. They say professionally dressed. Usually, I wore like a Class A, or if I couldn't get the Class A, like if it was the middle of the night or something, then I would wear some kind of like collared shirt type of thing or something to that effect.
Okay,
that's when the crime rate was increasing substantially in the city. A lot of call-outs during that time period.
Sure. A lot of violence.
Yeah, a lot of violence, culminating in like the late 90s. I think we had like 73 homicides or something to that effect, like in 96 or 97. So it was to the point where I would literally come home on Friday night from work. I'd set my pager on the nightstand. I'd take a nap because I knew within like within like an hour or so it would go off. Guaranteed it would go off.
Yeah.
Friday night, and it would go all weekend. We handled not only the homicides, but shootings and that type of thing, and all kinds of other stuff.
Now tell me where your career went from there, because you got promoted up the ranks.
Well, it's kind of hard to talk about, Jerry. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like a blur in a way. It just went so quickly. But it was one of those things in which, I was blessed. There was times where it was frustrating, and I was kind of wondering where it was going to go. But you do get in your kind of niche with planning. I was known as a project guy that I'm very proud of. Did a lot of different projects and team projects for the department, and had a lot of great teams I worked with throughout my career.
That's awesome.
And
you were primarily in operations?
I worked in operations. I was an operations guy.
So you were like a patrol sergeant at one point?
I was a patrol sergeant. In rarity, I was a patrol sergeant. Then I went back as administrative sergeant in planning and research chief's office. I actually had I can't remember exactly. I think I had like 3 tours in planning and research and chief's office throughout my career, and ended up over it as an assistant chief at one point. Came up through the operations side, services side. I was over the services side, which at various times of my career, and I was night commander too, which I just loved. Night commander was a great job.
Did they still have lieutenant when you were coming up?
Yes, lieutenant. I was acting lieutenant for 6 months, and then they eliminated the rank and made it the captain rank, and then I made captain.
Okay.
So I was a cadet, patrolman, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, major, colonel.
Awesome.
Light colonel is in the military system.
But you retired then as a lieutenant colonel, a deputy chief at our department.
Yes.
Okay. Now your family story doesn't end there, because somewhere along the line your son came into our department.
Yes. My son came in. Probably going to get this wrong on when he came on. I think it was 2012, I believe.
So he also overlapped you.
Yes.
By a few years.
He overlapped me by a few years. I overlapped my dad. Yes. It's one of those kinds of things in which I never really thought too much about it. But yeah, it was an interesting play, and then how that happened. It's like with my dad, I think it was a good thing. It was a good thing and a bad thing. But overall, I think it was a good experience for me. Now, my son, obviously, I don't know. He's still in his career.
Yeah, he's a sergeant now.
And he's a sergeant now. And he's been on about 12 years, I think, now, going on 13 years. And so obviously very proud of him. I know his grandpa would be very proud of him, too.
So there has been an Officer Steele at KCK since 1961.
Yes.
So 60-something years now.
60-plus years of continuous police community service, yes.
Yeah, in one city, in one department. That's awesome.
When I came on with my dad, he was in his position as a captain, as an XO.
But you were never, the department was big enough, you never were in a position to work for him.
Never in a position to work for him, never.
Yeah, and same thing with your son.
Yeah.
You guys overlap, but you're not in a position
the
where
department,
he worked for you.
Exactly. The department, it was so big that you never worked directly for your relative or your dad.
Yeah.
And so, no, I never worked directly for my dad.
Sure.
And my son never worked directly for me.
Did you ever feel like the people that were your direct supervisors were influenced by your dad? Did you ever feel like this was going to be a problem, like they're going to be harder on you, or even that they wouldn't be as hard on you because, well, this guy knows my dad and worked with my dad for years, and so there's a connection there?
It's a complicated thing, but I'll try to explain it. It's like there was those feelings, like you said. There was the ones that knew my dad, that there wasn't going to be any problem because they knew my dad, they knew me. Because my history as a police brat was that I was raised around that stuff. I remember accompanying my dad to the radio room when I was little. I remember being in the police car with him when he was PIO, and we would be out to dinner because he had to take the police car on call-outs, obviously, like I did years later. And so Mom and I, my sister would be in the car with my dad, and he'd get a radio call for some kind of a call-out, and so we would have to go with him.
Yeah.
And I remember very many times being in the police car watching these incidences go on. I can name some, but I won't go there. Some were actually pretty horrific, what I saw when I was little.
Mm-hmm. But you're on scene sitting in the car.
Yeah, I'm on scene sitting in the car watching this stuff going on. I was like 10, 11 years old, 12 years old. And in fact, later on, I don't know if I can mention his name or not, but a dear friend of mine who became chief, and two chiefs actually, later chiefs, they remember me being in the car because later on, after I retired from the PD, they said, "Hey, man, we remember you being in that, in the car with your dad when this thing was going on because we were there."
Yeah.
And I said, "Wow!" And so my whole point of that is that I remember really kind of being around it a lot.
Right.
It was kind of
so there were potentially people you were working for and with that you had a connection to because you were part of the police family before you were ever a sworn officer.
Exactly, and that's a good way of putting it, Jared. It was a police family, and I'll say a real tight family back then. It seemed like my perception of was when I was little, because like they didn't have daycare and stuff like that. So my dad, like I said, would take us up to the police department if he had a meeting, and the ladies there or whoever would watch us while we were out in the hall where they had toys and stuff. We were there playing and. Or outside the radio shack, and I could hear the dispatchers. And I remember my dad taking me when he was PIO into the dispatch shack to put out his little teletype on a press release, and I'd be in there and watching the dispatchers, hearing the radio traffic when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite things, actually, I sometimes wonder, well, is this why I wanted to become a policeman or not, was I loved police cars. So my dad would take me up to the police garage, and we'd be out riding around or something, and he'd take me to the police garage, and I'd get to get out in the police garage and go look at the police cars. I was fascinated by police cars. Still am.
Yeah.
And so that was one of those things where I would be in the garage, and the guys in there would be in there servicing the cars, and they'd say, "Yeah, man, you want to take a look at this police car?" And they'd be in there wrecked and whatever, and I'd be sitting there. I just loved looking at police cars.
Do you remember a make and model of any of those from that era?
Yeah, 77 Plymouth Furies, 72, 73 Plymouth Furies. Pontiac Le Mans, 77s. In fact, they had some of those when I came on the department.
In your book, those were good cars?
Oh, they were good cars. Yeah, they were. Now, the thing about them was that they weren't police package cars. They were just regular cars they converted into police cars. But they had the big engines on them, big block engines and that type of thing. So, so it was something to watch them and see them.
So the obvious advantage for you coming in is that you have a lot of the police culture, a lot of the lingo, a lot of the atmosphere just ingrained in you. So that certainly helped you come in. There wasn't a culture shock for you to start the job because you already were familiar with a portion of it.
Yeah, and let me explain that. I had a perception of it from outside, right? You know where I'm going with it. I had a perception of it, of what it was like. But I hadn't yet stepped into that arena. I was kind of like in the stands watching the game and kind of had my perceptions of how it went. But I hadn't stepped in the arena yet. And so when I stepped into the arena, then I figured, oh, wait a minute. In a way, this wasn't what I perceived and didn't know. In other words, I didn't know what was behind the door. I kind of thought I knew what it was.
Right.
But I really didn't.
Do you think your dad tried at any point to explain that to you, or was he willing to let you just learn that on your own?
Oh, my dad, you had to know my dad. He let me learn it on my own. God love him. I mean, and I'm glad he did.
Yeah.
He did not hold my hand. In fact, the conversation I had with him when I made sworn rank, I remember him telling me, actually, even when I got on the department, he said, don't look for me any favors. I'm not going to help you. You're on your own. And if you make it on your own. If you fail on your own. I never will forget him telling me that. He never, as far as I know, he never really influenced my career. And I'm glad he was that way. What I did on my own. Now, the perception was that wasn't the case by some people, obviously.
Oh, there's always the
but that's
naysayer
okay.
that assumes that, you've got a relative here. There must be nepotism.
Yeah.
They must be passing favors down to you. But from your perception, you never saw that.
No, I never saw that. In fact, I went through some tough times because my last name was Steele on the department. And, my dad was at a rank where, some people loved him, and some people didn't like him. Yeah. And that's the way it goes. And I realized that when I went up into ranks is that you can't please everybody, and some people aren't going to be satisfied with what you decide for whatever reasons, and they're not going to like you, right? And so, it was times where it was difficult.
I go to a lot of roll calls, and I listen to a lot of officers gripe, and they often gripe about administration. And so what's it like being a young officer and hearing somebody just, rail against your father?
Well, I would just keep my mouth shut because some of it was they were trying to pump me. They were trying to create an incident or create some kind of thing to complain on Officer Steele about. So you had to learn how to play the game. And that was from superiors that supervised me that didn't like my dad for various reasons. And so they would try to pump me or say something or whatever. Not all the time.
Try to provoke you?
Yeah. And so you just learn to play the game. You learn to let it roll off your back, as my dad used to say. Say, hey, let it roll off your back. Don't worry about it. Because the old adage was they're not going to be there forever.
Yeah.
And so that was always my philosophy as I went through the department. My years and tenure was those people aren't going to be here forever, and I'll just do my job, because the main thing is always do your job. And that was the thing my dad always told me. He said, and that's what I tell my son, do your job. Do your duty, do your job. Don't worry about everything else.
Is there anything about your dad's era that you wish you could have had, that you wish you could have been a part of, that didn't exist when you were a cop?
Oh, that's a good question. My dad's era, anything as far as just the times? Or?
The times, the culture, the equipment, the whatever.
Some of that was still on when I came on. The respect factor was there. That didn't really start dissipating until later. The thing about law enforcement, in my opinion, there's always been people that didn't like it. Yeah. I saw that. I saw that a lot, too, when I was growing up, with some of the things my dad went through, with people just being mean. Yeah. We had a neighbor that she didn't like him for whatever reason. He had his police car, he was on call, so she would call on silly stuff. I mean, that's a part of what you put up with. That's a part of what it is. Yeah. But to answer your question, I think, I think there was... I don't want to go into this thing about respect, because respect to me is, it's there, it's been there, it's still there. There's different levels of it. Sure. I don't know, Jared.
Anything like equipment that they did away with that you wish you still had, or anything procedurally that they could do that you wish you still had? Your son would answer this question and goes, I wish we had their pursuit policies.
Yeah. I mean, and even in my generation, in my earlier part of my career, the pursuit policy was very laxed in a way.
Yeah.
But it was corrected because of my generation.
It's your fault.
Yeah,
Yes.
Exactly. I did like to chase people. I was a pursuit guy.
So anything about your dad's era that you envied?
The internal part of policing, not that I'm saying it's not a family now, but
You think they were closer then?
Yeah, well, I think it was a lot less complicated in a way. But I'm looking at it from my perspective, right?
Right. That's the only perspective you have.
It's the only one we have, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know exactly what he went through with that and what those people would say about that. I do think that policing was a lot simpler back then. Not saying
More
that was more straightforward.
Yeah.
Because society was simpler then, perhaps. Who knows?
Okay. What about your son's generation? You look at what he's doing right now, the equipment he has, the culture he works in. Is there anything that you wish you could have had when you were a young cop?
Oh, I think the equipment would have been cool. Some of the equipment they have is cool to have. I know that's a lot more complicated stuff in some ways, but just to have some of the equipment, the police vehicles in themselves, I mean, depending on the era, the 91 Ford Crown Vics were pretty cool. And the 87 Chevy Impalas or Caprices, they were running cars.
Yeah.
But some of their equipment, not all their equipment, sometimes I think they got too much equipment now, and that we really need to concentrate in policing on the communication aspects and those types of things, because in the end, it's all about people.
Yeah.
How to deal with people. In fact, I actually got an article I'm writing for IACP on this right now, in which it's about the people and serving the people. Not saying I'm not doing that. I'm just saying it's not all about technology and equipment. It's good, but also in the end, your service is about helping people. Every night, 2:00 in the morning, you're talking to somebody, whatever, and you're trying to solve their problem.
So if you had a time machine, you were a young officer, first 5-10 years of your career, you could reach through time and grab one piece of equipment, bring it back to when you were a young officer. What would it have been?
I think combination on the field, it would have been some of the, like the tasers, those types of things that are better at restraining people, those types of things. And then on a communications angle, we had computers and stuff, but obviously some of the stuff they can do now with, intersections that are live and up and running, and you can see stuff that's going on, that type of thing, that would have been great.
Yeah.
Even on attack call out when I was incident commander, to have some of the stuff they have now at their disposal with, they can pull up, a pole cam or something. They have drones, those types of things they can use. So, those types of things would have been great.
Is there anything about your experience coming on to a department where your dad was a commander that affected how you communicated to your son when he came on, when you were a commander? Did you tell him anything? Was there anything from your own experience that you passed on, or you're like, hey, watch out for this, or don't worry about that? Any of those lessons that you remember passing on to your son?
My son, I just told him, I said, do your job. Do your duty. Do the job. Obey the policies, procedures, and rules. Do your job, and good things will happen. In other words, don't worry about everything. Don't worry about the fact that, don't overthink it. Because if you're doing your duty and you're doing your job, you're doing it correctly, good things will happen. And that's what I used to tell even people I mentored in the ranks coming up, and those I trained and everything. I said, just do your job. That's all. Don't get caught up in the drama of the department, or policing, I should say to the audience. This is the drama of policing. Policing has its own culture in itself. I know that. I've been raised around it, came up through it. Cops sometimes are their own worst enemies with this stuff. And it's a special way of life, but we also can't get hung up on that either. We have to also remember that we are servants of the public, and we have to be humble about what we do. And that's what I told my son. Be humble about what you do. Many people look up to you. And like I told my students when I used to teach it in college, you're in that fishbowl. Some of my recruits would still come up and tell me that I had in the academy. when I used to say you're in a fishbowl as a public official, as a police officer, which is a public official, as we know.
Yeah.
And so you have to live your life accordingly on and off duty.
Yeah,
and
always being watched.
Yes,
always
and
being judged.
And that's what I picked up from my dad growing up around it, was that it's never really ever over. You know, it's off-duty conduct, what you do off-duty, you have to be careful because people are watching that. And so that was one of the advantages of coming up through it as a little guy and seeing it, was that it's not something like you see on TV. It's a different lifestyle altogether in a police family culture. And
well, let me ask about that. So you had a father who was in this. Your son eventually joins, but you also had like brothers-in-law and other relatives who were police officers. So and most of them in the same department.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
So what's it like at the backyard family barbecue? What's good about everybody having working at the same place? What's bad about everybody working at the same place?
You see me laughing about that. Yeah, it's got its advantages and disadvantages, as you know, people can suspect.
Yeah.
In that culture, like we going back to the outside barbecue type thing scenario, it would maybe come up, maybe something would ask something about something like, "Hey man, what happened on that call the other day? You know anything about that call? You know, I heard something about it." And, and somebody in the family might say, "Yeah, man, it was some kind of a shooting or something or whatever."
Right.
But, you know, it was more like within the internal part of the family, as far as a wellness thing, it was more like, "Hey, man, are you okay with what happened there?" Especially if it was something that particular family member might have actually been dealing with.
Right.
And so it's
unlike a lot of police officers who don't feel they can talk to their family at all, because they don't want to like cause secondary trauma. But you guys were able to, at least at some appropriate level, kind of debrief a little bit. You were able to decompress and let that out.
Exactly. I actually encouraged it. My father, he came from a different generation. He really didn't talk too much about it, but I learned from that. And so I knew that if I ever had a relative or my son or daughter, whoever wanted to become a policeman, that I would kind of change that. And so I encouraged like conversations like, "Hey man, you okay?" You know, with Mike or whoever, like, "Hey man, you okay with what happened? You know, maybe it been some death of some, you know, child or something like that." And as a wellness technique, and I think it's very important. And that's one of the advantages that we had as a law enforcement family, is that we could just, "Okay, tell me about it. Don't tell me the whole thing. I don't want to know about the ins and outs of it." I just kind of like,
don't need the gory details.
Yeah, I don't need the details. You know, a lot of times I could relate to what he was talking about, or my dad would relate to what I was talking about if I did say something to him. And just having that outlet to talk about it, in my opinion, really helps.
Yeah.
And it helped me. I know it, and that is one of the advantages of having, you know, relatives in policing or law enforcement, is that sometimes you can relate to it better, because you do a lot of the things that we see in law enforcement. A lot of people, my experience, you'd be telling some kind of deal to somebody about something that happened on the job, and they kind of look at you like, "Really? You know, you making it up or what?"
Right.
And whereas, you know, when you come from it and you saw it and you've been there, you kind of go, "Okay, yeah, that makes sense."
Yeah, your family understood.
Yeah. You know. And so it wasn't where you're trying to make them believe it. You're just there to listen and go, "Okay, yeah, we're your sounding board."
Yeah.
And we're going to listen to what you have to say. And a lot of times I'd always end up by saying, "Okay, you feel better about it now?" And yeah, Dad, I feel better about that. Okay, that's good. A key component of all of it that helped me through everything was a good spousal partner support in my personal life. I don't know where I would be without my wife.
What made your wife special about that? Was it because her brothers were involved, or
just her? There's her personality and her, and our love for each other, and her willingness to listen to things. Because this is the thing about this. Your spouse or your significant other, whoever, your family, they live and breathe this thing with you when you're doing this.
Yeah.
And that's something we really need to emphasize in this, is that not only are you going through it, whatever it is, every day and night. That's sometimes bad stuff.
Yeah.
But your family, just by the way, them being your family, they're going to be somehow affected by it. It could be that you're in a bad mood because you just saw something last night or today and you just can't get out of your head. Mm-hmm. Or you got maybe some kind of complaint against you that you know is BS. You know, it's like, man, I cannot believe this is going on.
Yeah.
Because really in policing, a lot of it's the internal stress that you go through and pressure that you go through that really affects you more than the stuff you're dealing with in the field.
Yeah.
You have to have a good support system outside of police work, in your family, whatever it may be, mm-hmm. that are there for you to listen to you and understand what you're doing and what you're going through. To be healthy in this profession, you have to have other outlets. You have to have other things you're doing. You cannot live in cop world all the time. You have to have other outlets, other things you're doing that are not that cop related. That means have other friends outside of law enforcement besides cops. It's been said before, I know, and I'll say it again because I lived it. I had lots of friends and still do that are outside of law enforcement and other interest, most importantly, outside law enforcement. I had lots of hobbies, those types of things that I did and still do. And I encourage my son that way too, mm-hmm. because in the end, the career will eat you up if you let it.
Yeah.
And you have to, as you know, Chaplain, you've seen lots of that and talked to lots of officers about things like this. I know you've seen it and heard it too.
You need to be doing something other than law enforcement, something that you know, if you're building something, if you're repairing something, if you are growing something, those things are really healthy for you, and it has nothing to do with being a cop.
Absolutely.
And that's going to help you.
Absolutely.
Did you ever have a point where you didn't want Michael to follow in your footsteps?
It's an interesting story on that. I never really thought that he would follow in my footsteps, Jared.
Just different personality.
Yeah,
than you,
well,
or
it really never occurred to me. It was a lot of things going on. He was going to college. He had baseball scholarship to St. Mary's. He was pitching up there, that type of thing. I didn't really know he was interested in law enforcement until later on.
Oh, wow.
And he actually surprised me when he put his application in to the department. And I was like, "Oh, you did that?" And he goes, "Yeah, Dad." And he did actually say, "You know, I always admired what you did, and that's why I want to be what you're doing." And I was like, "Wow, okay." But it wasn't anything where you hear stories about certain families like they'll try to steer them into something.
Right.
Any profession.
Right.
Be it,
have this heavy expectation that you must follow in the family business.
Yes, and that could be any family business, right? It could be roofing or
a lot of small business owners. Just
small
feel like
business.
their kids have to take up the same job.
Yeah, I know a lot of lawyers that they follow in the business of their fathers and that type of thing.
Yeah.
But I never did anything like that. It was just kind of like one of those things where later on, he told me, well, I was just around it.
Yeah.
And I saw you doing it, and I thought that would be kind of a cool thing to do. So, yeah, it wasn't anything that I tried to steer him into.
Why do you think so many cops, at least what they'll say, is they don't want their kids to go into it? Now, how they actually feel may be different, but that's a stereotypical thing to say for a cop to be like, "Oh, I don't want my kids to do this." Why do you think they say that?
I don't know.
Is it just cynicism?
It could be. It's sometimes I think it's a part of their career. The cynicism. It may be a protective mechanism for themselves. Also, yes. I'm not a psychiatrist, obviously, but it may be having lived it. It could be some of that. I've heard a lot of that. I heard a lot of that. But like you said, I would hear it, but then all of a sudden, if they did get into law enforcement, they were so proud, right?
Right.
And
yes.
so I'm like, okay.
That's what I see. Yeah. So I don't want my kid to do it right up until they're walking across the stage to have their badge pinned on, and then they're just beaming with pride. Right.
Beaming with pride, yeah. And that's good. It's all good. I think that, it's one of those professions. Obviously, it's a way of life, and it's not something that everybody can do. And I know that even when I was teaching the subject in college to my students, I would tell them that. It's a different way of life altogether. But I think that it's a great, great calling. And I always encouraged people. Obviously, I had some students in college who are now in the department and in various other levels of criminal justice couple of them are attorneys now. And so the criminal justice system in itself, yes, does it have issues? Does it have things that can be adjusted and fixed? Yes. But you got to become a part of the solution, like anything in life. And that's what I encouraged people, even when I was teaching, and say, hey, become a part of the solution. And so that's why if somebody comes up to me and says, hey, my son or daughter's interested in being law enforcement, I said, why not? You got to love a challenge. And that's how I was anyway. I always loved a challenge.
Tell me more on that. Give me your best pitch. If you put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is in law enforcement and they're looking at their children and thinking, oh no, what if they try to follow me? And I'm not sure if I want that or not. Because maybe they've had a rough spell, or maybe they're in a rough season right now. What could you say to relieve some of that anxiety? What could you say to encourage them?
Don't overthink it. There's a reason why they're doing it. And it may be that their children are seeing that, but they also say, you know what, I want to try that. So let them try to be what they want to be. If they want to try that, let them try it.
Kevin, thank you so much for coming in today. I really do appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me here. Really do.
Thank you. I so appreciate Kevin coming in and for his son Michael for helping me arrange it. I love talking to retired cops, and I love talking to parents of cops, maybe even more, and all of this lived up to my expectations. This topic is particularly poignant for me because as a dad, I have 5 kids between ages 24 and 15. I've never asked them or even wanted necessarily for them to follow me into ministry, but I do wonder if, as a police chaplain, if any of them will end up crossing paths with the first responder world. Well, time will tell. Stay tuned, and I'll keep you updated on the next episode of Hey Chaplain.
But growing up the son of a police officer was really cool because I just remember some of my youngest memories seeing my dad when he's getting ready to go in for a shift and just putting that nice, clean, crisp uniform on. Back then, they still had the real thick patent leather duty belts. And just everything. I was just so proud of my dad and seeing the pride that he had when he put that uniform on and was going out to serve the public and serve our community.
I am so grateful to those who are quietly helping behind the scenes to keep this show free for everyone. If you want to help this show reach cops, chaplains, and other first responders around the world, please consider making a $5 donation by following the link in the episode description. The views expressed here are the personal views of the host and our guest and do not necessarily represent the views of any law enforcement agency or its components. If you like this episode, please share it with a cop or someone who loves a cop. Thank you for listening to Hey Chaplain, and as always, pray for peace in our city.